All right, let's just jump right in. In this explainer, we're going to objectively unpack a highly partisan media segment. We are really going to look under the hood of modern political commentary to see exactly how a broadcaster builds a compelling, albeit highly stylized argument. We'll be analyzing a specific broadcast to see how the commentator takes hard, undeniable macroeconomic statistics and blends them with extremely sharp, subjective political rhetoric to persuade their audience. By breaking down these specific tactics, we can all become much better, more savvy consumers of political media. So let's get into it. So, the entire critique we're examining today was actually triggered by this exact verbal slip-up in Parliament. Amanda Rishworth, who is the current Minister for Employment and Workplace Relations, was attempting to say Labour hire loophole, but instead she stumbled and she said Labour liar loophole. Now, in the incredibly fast-paced world of political commentary, a moment like this is just pure gold. The commentator seizes upon this very brief slip of the tongue to launch a massive, multi-pillared attack against the entire current administration. Which brings us to pillar 1 of our analysis, the employment gaffe and labor statistics. Our first pillar focuses on how the source uses this verbal gaffe, not just for a quick laugh, but really as a bridge to transition directly into a harsh, data-driven critique of the nation's current employment situation. Notice exactly how the commentator weaponizes a simple misspoken phrase here. By highlighting the employment minister's confusion of hire with liar, the host is actively branding the entire government with a pervasive narrative of dishonesty. The commentator playfully suggests that the minister was actually, saying the quiet part out loud. It's a really classic rhetorical device. You take a harmless human error and frame it as a subconscious admission of a broader, systemic political failing. It sets this mocking tone that absolutely carries through the rest of the segment. But a media takedown can't just rely on mockery, right? It needs actual substance. To ground their political mockery in real data, the commentator immediately pivots. They cite these specific July figures sourced directly from the ABC, and the data reveals a pretty significant drop in employment, driven largely by a fall in part-time jobs. We're talking 15,800 fewer employed individuals, alongside an increase of 4,200 unemployed. By bringing in reputable data right after the joke, the commentator validates their earlier mockery. They're effectively telling the audience, hey, don't just take my word for it, look at the actual numbers under her watch. And this right here perfectly demonstrates the commentator's core tactic. They are wrapping a very real, very serious macroeconomic statistic inside a highly personalized attack. Hitting the highest unemployment rate since the COVID-19 pandemic is a heavy, alarming piece of data. But rather than taking a step back and analyzing the complex global or domestic economic factors causing this, the commentator lays the blame squarely at the feet of the specific minister who just provided them with that viral blooper. The data gives weight to the rhetoric, and the rhetoric gives a very human face to the data. The source then takes the personal attack a step further. They actually dig into the minister's past to question her real-world credentials. The commentator pulls a quote from the minister where she claims to have felt the hard edge of 1996 workplace relations legislation after refusing an Australian workplace agreement at a large American retailer when she was just 19 years old. Well, the commentator gleefully reveals that this quote-unquote sinister corporation was actually Toys R Us. By chronologically mocking this timeline, contrasting a teenager's weekend job showing kids where the My Little Ponies were with the adult reality of the massive chain closing entirely in 2018, the commentator is trying to paint the minister as deeply out of touch and fundamentally unqualified to manage national employment. To cement this first pillar and completely capitalize on that liar loophole catchphrase, the commentator then recites a poetic, rhyming jingle. This serves as a rapid-fire rhetorical device to list off various alleged failures of the government. By delivering really complex policy critiques, things like productivity slumps, capital gains increases, and soaring energy bills, in a rhythmic, almost nursery rhyme format, the host makes the political attacks incredibly catchy and memorable for the viewer. It's an undeniably effective way to ensure the audience walks away with a specific checklist of grievances lodged right in their heads. Moving right along to Pillar 2, the trillion-dollar debt. Let's see how the commentator builds from those personal employment attacks into a sweeping critique of national macroeconomic management. Having already established the government as incompetent in their first pillar, they've laid the perfect groundwork to discuss the broader economy. And the commentator relies heavily on stark juxtaposition here. They ask the audience to compare the economic management of 20 years ago under the Howard-Costello government, which they highlight as having zero debt, with the current administration under Albanese and Chalmers sitting at a newly official $1 trillion debt. By placing these two absolute extremes side by side without any surrounding context about, global financial crises, pandemics, or inflation, the commentator frames the current situation purely as an outcome of chronic mismanagement. It is a powerfully simplistic way to visualize the issue for the audience.
So the crucial point the source really wants to isolate from that massive trillion-dollar figure is this number right here, $29.5 billion. That is the amount spent on interest alone every single year. Look, $1 trillion is often just too large of a number for the human brain to truly contextualize, so the commentator effectively narrows the scope down to just the annual interest payment. They invite the audience to think of the things we could have bought with that, which instantly translates an abstract economic concept into a tangible, frustrating missed opportunity for the average taxpayer.
And the commentator doesn't stop at the current figures either. The source emphasizes that this financial burden isn't static. They weaponize the future projection that these interest payments will soar to roughly $40 billion by the end of the decade. By projecting all of this pain into the future, the host effectively heightens the urgency and anxiety around the issue. They cap this segment off with a really sarcastic "great work, socialists," framing the entire economic situation not as a result of complex global market forces, but as a direct, completely predictable outcome of ideological failure.
And finally, we arrive at Pillar 3, critiquing climate messaging.
Here we are shifting gears entirely, moving from economic data to a cultural critique. Specifically, we're looking at how modern climate change activism is being communicated to the general public. The segment isolates and mocks two completely different, real-world climate messaging strategies to show what the host perceives as the utter absurdity of the movement. On one side, we have adult content creators on platforms like OnlyFans trying to make climate action sexy by exposing the quote-unquote dirty truth about big oil. On the other side, we have traditional, high-level politicians trying to frame climate science as undeniable fundamental physics. By placing these two radically different approaches side by side, the commentator is attempting to undermine the seriousness of the entire movement, basically painting its advocates as either totally desperate for attention or arrogantly academic. To really hammer this point home, the commentator highlights this specific quote from former Prime Minister Malcolm Turnbull, who literally compares believing in climate change to believing in gravity. The commentator uses this to mock the self-serious, authoritative tone of the political class. By playing the audio of politicians lecturing the public on basic gravity right after discussing adult entertainers jumping on the climate bandwagon, the host sarcastically invites the audience to judge for themselves. Which group is actually being more ridiculous here? It's a highly calculated use of contrasting audio bites designed entirely to generate a sense of cultural exhaustion in the viewer.
As we wrap up this explainer, I really want to leave you with this crucial question to consider the next time you watch a fiery political monologue. We've just seen exactly how a skilled commentator can take a simple misspoken word, tie it to genuine, concerning employment data, weave in historical, personal anecdotes, and then top it all off with trillion-dollar debt figures and cultural mockery, all to build an airtight narrative of government failure. The persuasion is entirely in the packaging. So the next time you find yourself nodding along or even shouting at the screen, ask yourself, how easily can you spot the raw, objective data hiding beneath all that heavy partisan spin? Thanks for joining me on this deep dive, and keep analyzing what you watch.